If you can believe it, I was challenged. On Reddit, somebody posted this thing, and then in the comments, somebody's like, CG Matter, you're the only one who can do it. And then somebody's like, I double dare you, and then I triple dare you. So they want me to make this result, and I'm not going to shy away from the challenge. Here's the version I created. Of course, it's not exactly the same, but it has the core principles, so I think I completed the dare, and let me show you how to make this one. It's actually a bit complicated, but it has new techniques that I had to think a long time about. I'm like, how do you make this?
This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them at the end of the video.
Here's how we do it. Completely geometry nodes, not a single thing other than this cube. Go to geometry nodes, take the cube, make it geometry nodes, and first of all, let me describe kind of the methodology that we're going to use. So we kind of want to generate a bunch of paths that are kind of constrained to a sphere, and for each one of those paths we have like a little particle moving alongside of it. That's how you want to think about it. So to make these paths, I did something a bit strange, so follow along here. Just take your hands away from the keyboard and just watch. What I did is I made a mesh line. The mesh line, I set it to endpoints and went from -1 to 1. So basically, we have a line that is composed of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 points, and it goes from bottom to top, -1 to 1. And then for each of these, and this is where it starts making sense, I used a circle. So I'm instancing a circle on each of these, okay? Now, the reason this should make sense at this point is these are the paths that we're going to be talking about. The particle is going to be traveling along these circles, and the idea, or really the goal, is how do we take these paths and constrain them to a sphere and randomize them and make them work and all this? Well, here's a key insight. Here's the trick. We're going to constrain it to the sphere. How are we going to do that? Well, we want to reset the position every time we want to move things around. Use the set position node, and I guess we should also realize instances so we don't have 10 instances of curves, but actual geometry and control points. We want to set position, and then instead of the original position, here comes the trick: vector math, normalize. And you can see it's almost like it's hugging or wrapping a invisible sphere. So why does this work? Well, what am I doing here? Well, we had a bunch of paths going from -1 to 1, and then I said take their position and normalize them. What that means is it means take the vector and look at its length, and if it's anything other than 1, make it 1. So in other words, if this point right here, if the distance from the origin is like 2 or something, it's saying, nope, constrain it back to 1. And it's doing that for every point. And what does that mean? It means they're all going to be equidistant from the center. We're normalizing them. They're all going to be normal. They're all going to be a distance of 1. So that's the trick. And then the -1 to 1 is just to make a nice wrap of the sphere. You could go a bit higher. So you could do -2 to 2. And you can see now it's kind of hugging the top a bit more. And we could increase the count. Okay, so the first key insight is you can take paths and normalize them to be on the sphere. Next, it's how do you make this thing look random? Well, if we take the position and we add a bit of noise or random value, I recommend noise so it's nice and continuous, and then we normalize it, any distortion we do is still going to be on the sphere. Okay? So we vector math, I'm going to add in some randomness, and you can see it looks scrambled, but it's still on the sphere as opposed to just being this mess, right? So we have the stack, we distort it, and then we normalize it. And now the question is, how do we make these paths usable? Well, first of all, I'm going to increase the resolution of each circle so we have more to work with, and I'm going to make these less chaotic. So I'm going to bring the scale down, I'm going to bring the detail down, and now you can see these are nice kind of distorted paths along the sphere. And we could add a bit of distortion too, just so they do something a bit more interesting. Not too much though.
Okay, thank you for watching my tutorial, a tutorial sponsored by Squarespace. If you don't already know, Squarespace is the easiest, it's the best way to build a website without doing any HTML nonsense. You just use Squarespace's templates, rearrange stuff around, and you have a professional looking website. In fact, my website, www.cgmatter.com, is made and will always be made with Squarespace. 3 features you might be interested in when it comes to making a website with Squarespace is 1, access to analytics, so you can see who's going to your website, where are they coming from, what, the information you need to target your audience. 2, you can embed social media feeds directly into your website, so you don't need to like redirect to Twitter. You can just put your Twitter feed directly in there, which is something that I think you might find super useful. And 3, automatic image cropping and positioning and all this. Literally, you just kind of put these blocks where you want them, and the formatting is done automatically. You don't need to mess with the stuff. And while Squarespace is already super affordable, I'm here to sweeten the deal. After you go to squarespace.com and use your free trial to, make a website and be like, this is what it looks like, you can use my link in the description to save 10% on your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you, Squarespace, for sponsoring, and thank you for watching the tutorial.
Okay. And if you want new paths, you can just use the W slider, but we're not going to get into that. So, cool. Let me increase this to 100, so we really have a lot of these. Each one gets a particle. And yeah, so we have paths. Now the question is, how do we have a particle going along each of these paths? Well, it's going to be a bit deceitful. We don't actually have an object or a sphere going around each of these. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to thicken the curve and then do some weird stuff to make it look like something's traveling alongside it. And then we got to do a lot more. So we're going to take these curves and turn them into meshes. This is the idea of making it actual geometry we can see. And let's make that lower res. By the way, a lot of times here I'm going to be reducing the resolution just so we have something that's actually viewable. And I'm going to take down the radius until you can actually see the individual strands. And there we go. By the way, we should save. I'm going to call this file available on Patreon because link in the description, you can download the blend file, and I'll talk about that later. Okay. So we have we have all that. Now I know I keep being like, now the question is, the goal is. I'm like a puppet. Somebody's pulling the strings, but he only knows one line, and I'm feeling the congestion coming. I actually have water for this. We have curves, and while I drink water, think about it. How do we take this and make it look like particles? That's right. We set the curve radius, so it's not the same everywhere. In other words, we don't make it equally thick everywhere. We make it very thin, except for one area. If you don't understand, I will show you. So set curve radius before curve to mesh. While this is still a curve, we're going to set the radius. We're going to look at the parameter. The parameter is basically saying what distance are we along, or what percent completion are we along the path, 0 to 1. We're going to look at the spline parameter, and you can see what this does is it's going to be a little hard to see this, but you can see it starts off very thin over here. So here's the before set curve radius. It's just a thick line. Now it's thinner, and as we travel around the sphere or along the path, these get thicker. It will be a little easier to see without the without the distortion. So they're very thin, and then as you go around, they get thicker. Let me add our distortion back in. Okay, this is kind of what we want, but we want a bit more control. So I want to say kind of create a little section of this where it's thick and everywhere else it's thin. So I'm going to start off with all of it infinitely thin, which kind of makes it invisible in a sense because it's all thickness of 0. So it's there, but not really. And then in the middle, I'm going to add a bit of thickness, and then I'm just going to constrain these. The closer these are, you can see it's kind of shortening these trails. The closer these are, the shorter the particle or trail thing is going to be. And you could be exact about this. I'm just going to kind of do it loosely until it looks the way I want it to. Okay. So you can see we've constrained it to, it kind of looks like particles now. I'm actually going to go even a bit closer. And this is a good opportunity. You can see kind of looks low resolution. This is, again, always because of the original resolution of the paths. So that makes it higher res. You could go crazy with it, but we're going to have a lot of these, so I'm going to stay at 150. And they're going to be moving. So you can see we have kind of like a cluster, an army, a marching band of particles. And they're all going to be kind of centered around halfway. Whoops. They're all going to be centered around halfway along the path. And I want these to be animated. So here's another trick, another key insight. If you do an addition and then you send it through the color ramp, it's going to look like it's going around the sphere, because now we're saying take this like section where we have the radius actually bigger than 1 and have it kind of shift up and down here. Now, of course, the issue is once you go too far, we run out of room in either direction. So take this, send it through a fraction that will keep it in a 0 to 1 interval, and now we have this. Let me animate it with time. So now we have these particles going around the sphere. And really, the rest of this tutorial is two things. It's randomizing this effect, so it's weird, but this is actually enough to get the final result. So we're just going to randomize it, and we're going to add a material. So for randomizing, first thing is I don't want them all to be along the same, thing. Some of them should be further up on the sphere, whatever. And the second thing is I want to randomize their speed. First of all, let's randomize the position, because that's more important. So again, addition is just a shifting. I want to randomize it, so I'm going to give a random value. And you can see it kind of does the right thing, but it kind of breaks it up. The reason this is the case is it's generating a random number for each point. What do I mean? Let's go back here. These are a bunch of curves. The curves are composed of points, okay? So each curve has 150 points. What I'm saying is the random value is giving 150 for each curve, whereas I want a random number per curve, not per point. Okay? Does that make sense? So this is doing it per point and it's breaking it up. Instead, what we want to do is for the ID, I'm going to use index, which changes nothing, but I'm going to snap or round to the nearest curve. What's a curve? It's 150 points in this case. So you can see now these are kind of clustered together and it looks more like what you would expect, kind of like fish swimming or something like that. And you could randomize this as much as you want. The closer these are to 0, the more kind of in sync they're going to be. So I'm just going to randomize them quite a bit, but not like so much that they look like unrelated. So I think that looks pretty good. And by the way, if we plan to change the resolution of the original curve, which was 150, it's good to just add a value node since we now have two dependencies. So if we change it now, it should still work. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing is we want to randomize the speed. If we multiply the time, so let's say we multiplied by 0.1, it's going to be 10 times slower. If we make it 1, full speed, 2, twice as fast. This is another parameter that we can randomize. So I'm going to do another random value, change the seed to something different, and then use the same ID. And now you can see some of them are frozen because they're at 0, and some of them are they're at full speed. I don't want any of them to be at 0. Maybe at slowest they could be 25%, and at fastest they could be 0.5, so you can kind of see what's going on. So we've randomized the offset and the speed, and this is kind of the first element of what we want. I'm going to increase this to 200. So now we have 200 of these. And what do I mean the first element? Well, this is just part 1 of the effect. Part 2 is we kind of have this spherical thing, and I want to add layers to it. So it's kind of like we have a sphere, and then I want a sphere inside the sphere, kind of like shells. And this is going to give it volume. And we don't have to do that much work to generate this, don't worry. So we have all this. All of this is going to be the sphere. I want to create layers for this, right? So how do I do that? I'm going to use a mesh line. It's going to make sense in a second. And I'm going to set the offset to 0. So basically, this is a line of 10 points right in the center. You can't even see it. If we made it taller, you could see it, but now there's 10 points collapsed on the 3D cursor. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to instance, now you're probably seeing what I'm doing here, I'm going to instance the thing that we created. Let's only make 3 copies. So now we have, you can't really tell, but we have 3 copies overlaid on top of each other. And if we now shrink each layer to make it a tiny bit smaller, then we've created the shells. In other words, the scale, we want it to be a function of the index. So you can see we have the first shell is, actually the first shell should be a scale of 0 because the index is 0. And then a scale of 1, a scale of 2. You can see we have the layers. We want to have control over this. So I'm going to do a multiply add. So indexing starts at 0, and then it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. So if it's 0, we want the scale to still be 1. So I'm going to add 1, and I'm going to multiply each layer. So now you can see all 3 layers. You can think of this multiplication as kind of the gap between them. So I want it to be negative and tiny. So you can see now we have 3 layers, and it's kind of like we've thickened the effect. Of course, we can increase this until you kind of go all the way towards the center. I'm just going to have like 5 or 6 layers. And that's good, but, thickens it, but it doesn't really, it just kind of looks weird. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to slightly rotate each one, so it looks like each layer is slightly progressed in front of the other, if that makes sense. So we could use the index for the rotation, which is going to make this super chaotic because each shell is just rotated by a large amount. And I'm just going to multiply that. If it's 0, again, we have the same thing. But as we increase this rotation, you can see each layer is going to be slightly in front of the other. So that you can still see the individual strips, and I'm just going to make it slightly bigger. You want it to look kind of random, but still kind of clustered. So if you set this to 1, this is like complete chaos. But here you can kind of tell there's some areas that are thicker than others, if that makes sense. And you could kind of see this kind of sphere, fluidy kind of look to this. And just to add a bit more chaos, I'm just going to have this thing rotating, and I'll use a driver for that. So the frame number divided by 60. This is just rotating the entire thing to make it look like there's more motion going on. So that's the core effect. The rest of this is just making a material. So let's just make a material. I'm not going to go too in-depth in this. It's kind of a simple material, but it looks good. So we want this kind of iridescent metal-looking thing. Here's how you make it. So I guess I glossed over this. After all this, I used a set material node set to material. So now in the shading workspace, anything we do to the material is going to be, happening on the mesh. So think about it for a second as I drink some water. How do we get the iridescent look? Well, we want a bunch of colors kind of dependent on the angle that we're looking at it from. And to do that, the angle we're looking at it from can be described by either Fresnel or facing. You can see it's kind of shading black towards the middle, and then as we wrap around it, it becomes white. For this, I found that facing looks a bit better. Just play with the number until you get something that looks like that. And then we take this black and white mask and send it through a hue saturation node connected to the hue. And this will generate, let's pick a number. This will generate the different colors. Why? Because we have a color and we're saying hue shifted. It kind of changed the color as a function of the view angle. Okay? And another thing we can do is we can have this color evolve over time by just adding. And you can see how the colors kind of look like they're going towards the center. That's because of the layer weight. So this is also going to be a function of time. So all of this together will make the effect look pretty complicated. And if you want, you could go a bit more in detail. Like you can make this a metal. You could add some, lower the roughness so it's a bit more reflective, add an HDRI. But this is the basic material that I think kind of gets you 90% of the way there. So I think that's kind of the essence of how to make this thing. Thanks for watching.